Chapter 1. The Threshold of Shadows. Lana Nguyen's hands tightened on the steering wheel of the rented minivan, her sharp eyes darting between the rain-slashed windshield and the dashboard clock. 3:47 p.m., March 24th, 2025. The wipers screeched against the downpour, barely keeping up as the narrow mountain road twisted through northern Vietnam's rugged peaks. Mist coiled around the trees, thick and gray, swallowing the jagged outlines of the forest. Her phone, propped on the passenger seat, buzzed with a faltering GPS voice. Turn, left in, recalculating, before the signal bars blinked out. "Come on, don't fail me now," she muttered, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. She'd driven hours from Hanoi, chasing a story that gnawed at her. 12 people missing from Thung Lung village in the past year. No bodies, no explanations, just whispers of something wrong. A notebook jostled on the seat beside her, spilling pages of scribbled notes. Names, dates, a tip from a shaky-voiced source in Hanoi about a village near the Chinese border that didn't welcome questions. The radio crackled to life, unprompted, static, hissing like a swarm of insects. Lana reached to silence it, but a faint whisper slipped through. "Chongjin, don't come." The words, in her parents' native Vietnamese, sent a chill down her spine. She snapped the dial off, her breath catching. "It's the storm," she told herself, though the excuse rang hollow. A low hum lingered in her ears, faint but persistent, like wind rattling through an empty tunnel. Outside, the trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. A deer darted across the road, its eyes flashing in the headlights before it melted into the mist. The minivan lurched over a pothole, tires skidding on wet gravel, and Lana steadied her grip. Then, through the rain, a faded sign swayed in the wind. "Thung Lung, 5 kilo." Relief flickered in her chest, tangled with a growing unease she couldn't shake. By dusk, she rolled into Thung Lung village, tires crunching on muddy earth. Wooden houses perched on stilts lined the single street, their thatched roofs glistening under the relentless rain. Lanterns swung from poles, casting flickering pools of light that danced across the stilts like restless shadows. Villagers paused, men in patched coats, women clutching baskets, staring as Lana parked near a sagging communal hall. Their faces were drawn, eyes hollowed by something deeper than fatigue. She stepped out, boots sinking into the muck, and slung her backpack over her shoulder. The air hit her hard. Wet wood mingled with a sharp, sour whiff of decay carried on the wind. That hum was louder now, vibrating faintly through the ground, as if the earth itself pulsed with a secret. An old woman approached through the gloom, her wiry frame leaning on a bamboo staff. Her traditional ao dai clung to her legs, soaked at the hem, and her face was weathered, etched with lines like cracks in stone. Mrs. Hoa, as Lana would later learn, fixed her with eyes that pierced like needles. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped in Vietnamese, her voice rough as gravel. "Outsiders bring trouble." Lana squared her shoulders, brushing rain from her face. "I'm a journalist," she replied, her Vietnamese halting but firm. "I'm here about the missing people. 12 in a year. Can you tell me anything?" Mrs. Hawes' lips thinned into a grim line. She spat into the mud, a wet splat, and jabbed her staff toward the dark forest beyond the village. "The hollow takes what it wants," she said. "You'll see soon enough." Before Lana could press her, the old woman turned, hobbling toward a house with a creak of wooden steps. The other villagers scattered, doors thudding shut, leaving Lana alone in the rain-soaked silence. She pulled out her phone, snapping a photo of the village's eerie stillness. The flash caught something, A shadow darting between houses, too fast, too jagged to be human. "Lana!" A whisper hissed on the wind, faint but clear. She spun, heart pounding, scanning the empty street. Nothing but mist and swaying lanterns. "What am I walking into?" she murmured, the words lost in the drizzle. Shaking off the chill, she headed for a guest house, its sign creaking in the breeze. "Ngikwachem. Rest for the night." She knocked, and an elderly man peered out, his face blank as he handed her a key without a word. As she stepped onto the porch, her boots left muddy prints beside another set, tracks that trailed to the edge and stopped abruptly as if their maker had vanished into thin air. The hum swelled, coiling around her like a living thing. She gripped the key, its cold metal biting into her palm, and pushed the door open, stepping into the dim unknown. Chapter 2. The First Whisper. Lana Nguyen pushed the guesthouse door shut behind her, the creak of its hinges swallowed by the steady drum of rain on the roof. The room was small and dim, lit only by a single bulb dangling from a frayed cord, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It was just past dusk, on March 24th, 2025, and the air inside carried a damp chill that seeped into her bones. She dropped her backpack onto a narrow cot, its springs groaning under the weight, and rubbed her hands together, trying to shake the cold from her fingers. The hum from outside pulsed faintly through the walls, a low thrum that set her teeth on edge. She unpacked her gear with practiced efficiency. A digital camera, a voice recorder, a notebook already thick with scribbles. This was her lifeline, tools to unravel the mystery of Thung Lung's missing 12. She flipped open the notebook, her eyes scanning the latest entry. Hanoi contact. They hear voices, then they're gone. The words stared back at her, stark and unsettling. She'd heard the whisper in the van. Jungjen. And now that shadow between the houses. Too fast to be real. Her gut churned, but she shoved the doubt aside. She was here for answers, not ghosts. Lana plugged in the recorder and hit play, testing it with a murmured, "Thung Lung, day 1. Her voice echoed back, tinny but clear. She set it on the cot and rummaged for her charger when a faint scratching broke the silence. Sharp, insistent, like nails on glass. She froze, head snapping toward the window. The curtains hung still, heavy with dust, but the sound came again, louder. Heart thudding, she crossed the room in 3 strides and yanked the curtains aside. Nothing, just mist pressing against the pane, swirling in the lantern light from the street. The scratching stopped, leaving only the hum and the patter of rain. "Get a grip," she muttered, letting the curtains fall. But as she turned back, the recorder clicked on by itself, its red light blinking. She hadn't touched it. A hiss of static filled the room. Then her name. "Lana." The voice was soft, layered, like a dozen mouths speaking at once. She stumbled back, knocking into the cot. "Lana, come," it whispered again, clearer now, curling around her like smoke. She lunged for the device, slamming the stop button. Her hands shook as she rewound and played it back. There it was, her test recording, then silence, then "Lana, come." Undeniable, etched into the audio. "What the hell?" Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She stared at the recorder, its plastic casing suddenly alien in her hands. The bulb overhead flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. She set the device down like it might bite and grabbed her phone, typing a frantic note. Voice on recorder, not mine. 7:13 p.m. The hum outside grew louder, seeping through the cracks in the walls, vibrating in her chest. Lana paced the small room, her boots thudding on the warped floorboards. She'd heard stories, folklore from her parents about restless spirits, voices in the dark. But she'd always dismissed them as bedtime tales. Now, though, that whisper felt personal, like it knew her. She stopped, staring at the window again. The mist seemed thicker, pressing closer, and for a moment, she swore she saw a shape, tall, eyeless, its mouth gaping, before it melted away. She needed air. Grabbing her jacket, she stepped onto the porch, the damp wood creaking underfoot. The village stretched out before her, a cluster of stilted houses swallowed by the night. Lanterns swayed, their light barely piercing the fog. The street was empty, the villagers tucked away, but the hum was everywhere now, a living thing that pulsed with the rain. She took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and caught that whisper again. Lana, faint, carried on the wind. Her eyes darted to the forest beyond the village, where Mrs. Hoe had pointed earlier. The hollow. That's what the old woman had called it. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold. She pulled her jacket tighter, the muddy tracks from earlier still etched into the porch. Hers and those others that stopped at the edge, vanishing into nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, brushing her ear. Lana. She spun, but the porch was empty, the door still shut behind her. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced it down. She wasn't running. Not yet. She'd come for a story, and whatever this was, it was part of it. The hum swelled, a chorus of unseen voices threading through it, and she stepped back inside, locking the door with a trembling hand. The recorder sat on the cot, its red light off, but somehow watching. Outside, the rain fell harder, and the whispers lingered, waiting. Chapter 3. The Hollow's Edge. The morning of March 25th, 2025 broke over Thanglang village with a gray, heavy sky, the rain reduced to a thin drizzle that clung to everything like a second skin. Lana Nguyen stood on the guest house porch, her breath fogging in the chill as she sipped bitter instant coffee from a chipped mug. Sleep had eluded her. The whispers, "Lana, come," echoing in her mind long after the recorder fell silent. The hum pulsed through the village, a constant undercurrent she couldn't escape. Her phone lay heavy in her pocket, the audio file from last night, a weight she wasn't ready to face again. She needed answers. The hollow, Mrs. Hoa's cryptic warning, gnawed at her. She'd cornered a young villager earlier, a wiry boy named Tuan, barely into his 20s. With nervous eyes and hands that fidgeted with a frayed scarf, he'd reluctantly agreed to show her the path, muttering about bad omens under his breath. Now he waited at the edge of the village, shifting from foot to foot as Lana laced her boots and slung her camera over her shoulder. Her notebook was tucked into her jacket, pages already damp from the air. "Ready?" she called, her voice cutting through the stillness. Tuan nodded, avoiding her gaze, and led her down a muddy trail that snaked into the forest. The houses faded behind them, swallowed by mist and the twisted shapes of ancient trees. Their branches arched overhead, forming a tunnel of skeletal limbs that dripped with moisture. The hum grew louder with every step, vibrating up through her boots, a sound that felt alive, hungry. Tuan walked fast, head down, his scarf fluttering like a flag of surrender. "How far?" Lana asked, her Vietnamese rough but clear. "Not far," Tuan mumbled, his voice barely audible. "But no one goes there. Not anymore." "Then why do people keep disappearing near it?" She pressed, adjusting the camera strap. He didn't answer, just quickened his pace. The trail steepened, roots bulging from the earth like veins, slick with mud. Lana's boots slipped, and she caught herself against a tree, its bark cold and damp under her palm. The air thickened, carrying a faint rot, like wet leaves left too long in the dark. She glanced back. The village was gone, lost in the fog. After 20 minutes, Tuan stopped abruptly at the edge of a ravine. "There," he said, pointing down. Lana stepped beside him, her breath catching. The hollow sprawled below, a gaping wound in the earth, its steep walls cloaked in mist that churned like a living thing. Gnarled trees ringed its edge, their roots dangling into the drop, clawing at the void. The hum roared here, a deep, resonant drone that rattled her ribs. She squinted into the haze, but the bottom was invisible, swallowed by shadow. "No one goes down there," Tuan said, his voice trembling. "The dead don't like it." Lana raised her camera, snapping photos of the eerie expanse. "If it's so dangerous, why don't you warn people away?" "We do," he snapped, eyes flashing. "They don't listen, like you." A branch snapped behind them, sharp and sudden. Tuan flinched, spinning around. "We should go," he whispered, already backing away. Lana lingered, zooming in with her camera. The mist shifted, and for a split second she saw them. Faces, pale and eyeless, mouths stretched wide, hovering in the fog. Her stomach lurched. She lowered the camera, blinking hard, and checked the screen. The faces were gone. The image just mist and trees. "Tuan, did you—" she started, but he was already bolting back down the trail, his scarf a blur in the fog. She cursed under her breath, her pulse racing. The hum swelled, threading with whispers now. "Stay, stay," soft and insistent, tugging at her mind. She took one last photo, the shutter clicking like a gunshot in the silence, and turned to follow him. But something held her back. She glanced at the hollow again, its mist curling upward like tendrils. A shape flickered at the edge, a figure, tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally. It didn't move, just watched. Her mouth went dry. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root, and forced herself to walk away, the whispers chasing her steps. By the time she reached the village, Tuan was gone, vanished into one of the stilted houses. The hum followed her, quieter now, but no less alive. She sat on the guest house porch, hands shaking as she scrolled through the photos. The last one showed the hollow's edge, the mist thick and gray, and there, faint but unmistakable, was a smear of shadow, a figure with no face, standing where she'd seen it. Lana set the camera down, her coffee cold in her mug. The hollow wasn't just a place, it was waiting. Chapter 4. The lost tape night settled over Thuong Long village like a shroud on March 25, 2025, the drizzle giving way to a damp, oppressive stillness. Lana Nguyen sat cross-legged on the guest house cot, the dim bulb overhead casting a sickly yellow glow across her face. Her camera rested beside her, its screen still displaying that last photo from the hollow, a shadowy smear where a figure shouldn't have been. The hum thrummed through the walls, steady and relentless, a heartbeat she couldn't ignore. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her, but sleep felt impossible after the hollow's edge, those eyeless faces in the mist, and the whispers that wouldn't leave her alone. She pulled her laptop from her backpack, its screen flickering to life as she connected the camera. The photos loaded one by one, misty trees, the ravine's jagged lip, that final haunting image. She zoomed in on the shadow, her breath catching. It was vague, blurred, but the outline was human. Too tall, too thin, its head cocked at an angle that made her skin crawl. "What are you?" she murmured, her voice swallowed by the hum. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. She wasn't here for ghosts. She was here for facts. Lana opened her notebook, flipping to a page of scribbled leads. She'd found an old forum post in Hanoi, buried in a thread about rural vanishings. Thunglung, 1752. Plague killed half the village. Survivors sealed the hollow with salt. It's waking again. The words stared back at her, stark and cryptic. She typed them into her laptop, cross-referencing with what little she could pull up on the spotty village Wi-Fi. A grainy scan of a colonial record popped up, mentioning a spirit of the hollow, blamed for the deaths. The last line chilled her. It takes the living to replace the lost. A knock jolted her from the screen. Sharp, hesitant. She closed the laptop and crossed to the door, peering through the crack. Tuan stood on the porch, his scarf pulled tight around his neck, eyes darting like a cornered animal. In his hands was a battered VHS tape, its label scratched and faded. "My brother filmed this," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the hum. "Min." Before he vanished, he thrust the tape at her, stepping back as if it burned him. "You wanted answers. Here." "Tuan, wait," Lana started, but he was already gone, melting into the misty street. She shut the door, locking it, and turned the tape over in her hands. No title, just a date scratched into the plastic. 03/12/24, 3 months ago. Her pulse quickened. She didn't have a VHS player, but she'd seen an old TV in the guest house's common room downstairs, gathering dust beside a stack of moldy cushions. Grabbing her recorder and phone, she slipped into the hall, the floorboards creaking under her boots. The common room was empty, the air stale and thick with the scent of mildew. The TV sat in the corner, its screen coated in grime. She wiped it with her sleeve, plugged in the VCR, and slid the tape into the slot. The machine whirred, reluctant, then clicked to life. Static filled the screen, then resolved into shaky footage, a handheld camera panning across the hollow's edge. Min's voice came through tense but steady. "March 12th, I'm going down. People need to know." The camera dipped, showing muddy boots descending the ravine's slope, roots snagging at his legs. The hum roared through the speakers, louder than ever, drowning out his breathing. Lana leaned closer, her recorder rolling beside her to capture every sound. The footage jerked as Min reached the bottom, panning to a cave mouth carved into the hollow's wall, black, jagged, like a wound in the earth. Something moved inside, a flicker of shadow too quick to catch. "What's that?" Min muttered, stepping closer. Then a voice, not his, hissed through the static. "You're mine." It was deep, layered, like the whispers that had called her name. The screen cut to black, the hum abruptly silent. Lana's mouth went dry. She rewound the tape, her fingers trembling on the controls. The footage played again. Min's descent, the cave, the shadow. But this time, as he panned across a puddle, his reflection stared back. No face, just a black void where his eyes and mouth should have been. The voice hissed again. "You're mine." The screen snapped to static, and the VCR whined, spitting the tape out. She stumbled back, knocking the recorder to the floor. It clattered, still running, its red light blinking like an accusing eye. The hum surged through the room, vibrating the walls, and she swore she heard it again. Her name woven into the sound. "Lana!" She grabbed the tape, clutching it to her chest, and fled back to her room, the door slamming shut behind her. The bulb flickered as she sank onto the cot, the tape cold in her hands. Min had gone looking for answers, and something had taken him. Now it knew her name too. Chapter 5. The Footage. The guest house room felt smaller than ever on the night of March 25th, 2025, its walls pressing in as Lana Nguyen sat hunched on the cot, the VHS tape from Tuan clutched in her lap. The single bulb buzzed overhead, its light flickering like a dying pulse, casting jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The hum seeped through the floorboards, a steady throb that matched her racing heartbeat. She'd locked the door after fleeing the common room, but the lock felt flimsy, useless against whatever had spoken through Min's tape. "You're mine." Her recorder sat beside her, its red light off, but still somehow watchful. a silent witness to the night's unraveling. Lana's laptop glowed on the cot, the only steady light in the room. She'd rigged an old USB converter to digitize the tape, unwilling to trust the creaky VCR downstairs again. Her hands trembled as she plugged it in, the screen flickering as the footage loaded. She needed to see it again, needed to understand what Min had found, what had taken him. The hollow's shadow loomed in her mind, those eyeless faces from the mist, the figure in her photo. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was clawing at her, whispering her name. The video started, grainy and unsteady, Min's boots crunching through the hollow's muddy slope. His voice cut through the hum, tight with nerves. March 12th, I'm going down! People need to know! The camera jolted with each step, roots snagging at his legs, the ravine's walls rising like a trap. Lana leaned closer, her breath shallow, the hum from the speakers syncing with the one outside. Louder, deeper, a growl from the earth itself. Min reached the bottom, panning across the hollow's floor, barren, littered with broken branches and strange, smooth stones that gleamed wetly in the dim light. There, Min muttered, his camera swinging to the cave mouth she'd seen before. Black and jagged, a maw carved into the ravine's side. The hum peaked, rattling the laptop speakers, and something shifted inside the cave, a shadow, quick and fluid, like ink spilling across the frame. What's that? Min said, his voice spiking with fear. He stepped closer, the camera trembling in his grip. Then it came. The voice, not his, a guttural hiss that layered over itself. You're mine. The screen flared white, then cut to static, the hum vanishing into silence. Lana's stomach twisted. She rewound, her finger hovering over the keys, dread pooling in her chest. The footage replayed, Min's descent, the cave, the shadow. But this time, as he panned across a puddle, his reflection stared back. No face, just a black void, eyeless and mouthless, rippling in the water. You're mine, the voice hissed again, and the shadow in the cave lunged, fast, too fast, a blur of darkness that swallowed the frame. The screen snapped to black, the laptop whining as if overloaded. She dropped the tape, her hands flying to her mouth. The reflection, that void, wasn't a trick of the light. It was him, or what was left of him. The hum surged back, vibrating through the room, and her recorder clicked on unprompted, its red light blinking. Lana, the whispers came, soft and layered, spilling from the speakers. She scrambled to shut it off, but the voices kept going. Come, come. Her name wove through the sound, a chorus of the lost calling her to the hollow. The bulb flickered violently, plunging the room into brief darkness before flaring back. Lana stumbled to the window, yanking the curtains aside. The mist outside pressed thick against the glass, swirling with shapes, tall, thin, eyeless, watching her. She blinked, and they were gone, just fog and lantern light. Her reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed, but whole. For now. She sank onto the cot, the tape beside her like a cursed relic. Min had gone looking for truth and found something else. Something that erased him piece by piece. Her phone buzzed, startling her. A text from her Hanoi contact, Dr. Pham, a folklorist she'd messaged earlier. Don't watch it again. It sees you now. Too late. The hum pulsed louder, threading with whispers that scratched at her skull. Lana, come. She grabbed her notebook, scribbling frantically. Min's tape. Cave, shadow, no face. It knows me. Her pen shook, ink smudging the page. The hollow wasn't just taking people, it was claiming them, stripping them down to nothing. And now it had her scent. She glanced at the recorder, its light off again, but the whispers lingered in her ears, a promise she couldn't unhear. Outside, the village slept, oblivious or resigned. The hum rolled on, a tide pulling her closer to the edge. She hugged her knees, the tape cold against her leg, and wondered how long she had before it came for her too. Chapter 6. The Warning. The morning of March 26, 2025 dawned over Thunglung village with a sluggish, oppressive haze, the mist clinging to the stilted houses like a shroud. Lana Nguyen stood on the guest house porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, the bitter taste lingering on her tongue. She hadn't slept. Min's faceless reflection haunted her, the whispers from the tape looping in her mind. "Lana, come." The hum pulsed through the muddy ground, a constant tremor she felt in her bones. Her laptop sat inside, the digitized footage a digital specter she couldn't bring herself to watch again. Dr. Pham's text, "It sees you now," burned in her memory, a warning she'd ignored too late. The village stirred slowly, villagers shuffling toward a small market square near the communal hall. Baskets of rice and dried fish passed hands, but the air was thick with silence, faces drawn and eyes averted. Lana pulled her jacket tighter, the damp fabric sticking to her skin, and headed toward the square. She needed answers, something solid to anchor her against the hollow's pull. Mrs. Ho's words, "The hollow takes what it wants," echoed in her head, a riddle she couldn't unravel alone. She spotted the old woman at a stall, her wiry frame bent over a pile of herbs, her bamboo staff propped against a crate. Lana approached, her boots squelching in the mud. "Mrs. Hoa," she said, her Vietnamese halting but firm. The woman didn't look up, her gnarled hands sorting leaves with mechanical precision. "I need to talk to you about the hollow." Mrs. Ho's eyes flicked up, sharp and cold, piercing through the haze. "You've seen it now," she rasped, her voice like dry twigs snapping. "Heard it, and still you stay." "I watched a tape," Lana said, her throat tight. "Min, Tuan's brother, went down there. Something took him. What's in that cave?" The old woman's lips thinned, her hands pausing over the herbs. "The hollow keeps the restless," she said, jabbing a finger toward the forest. "Feed it silence, or it takes more. That's all you need to know." Before Lana could press her, a scream tore through the square, a high, keening wail that silenced the murmurs. Villagers turned, their faces paling, as a young woman stumbled from the trail to the hollow, her hands clutching her hair. "My son!" she cried, collapsing to her knees. "He's gone! Who's gone?" Lana's stomach dropped. She pushed through the crowd, reaching the woman as a man. Her husband, maybe, knelt beside her, his voice breaking. He was playing near the path. Lana followed their gazes to the trail's edge. A child's shoe lay in the dirt, its laces untied, mud smeared across the sole. The hum surged, a deep rumble that shook the ground, and whispers threaded through it. "Stay, stay." Soft and insistent, tugging at her ears. Villagers backed away, some clutching amulets, others muttering prayers. Mrs. Hoa hobbled forward, her staff sinking into the mud. "Another one," she said, her voice flat, resigned. She spat into the dirt, glaring at Lana. "You brought this. Outsiders wake it." "I didn't," Lana started, but the accusation stung. She'd come asking questions, stirring the village's fragile peace. The hum swelled again, vibrating her skull, and she caught it. Her name, faint but clear, Lana. The crowd didn't react, their eyes fixed on the shoe, but she knew it was meant for her. Mrs. Hoa gripped her staff, leaning close, her breath sour with age. "Leave, girl, before it claims you too." She turned away, hobbling back to her stall as the young mother's sobs filled the air. Lana stood frozen, the shoe a silent accusation in the mud. The whispers grew louder. Come, curling around her like a noose. She stumbled back to the guest house, her boots heavy with guilt and fear. The village felt smaller, the mist thicker, pressing in from all sides. She sank onto the porch steps, her hands shaking as she pulled out her notebook. "Hi, child, missing today. Hollows active," she wrote, the pen digging into the page. The hum pulsed beneath her, a living thing, and she wondered if Mrs. Hoa was right, if her presence had stirred something awake. Her phone buzzed, a new text from Dr. Pham. "Salt and silence, old ways might hold it back." She stared at the words, the child's shoe flashing in her mind. The hollow wasn't just taking, it was feeding, growing bolder, and it knew her name. The whispers lingered, a promise in the mist, as the village mourned another loss she couldn't explain. Chapter 7. Descent night fell over Thung Lung village on March 26, 2025. A suffocating darkness that swallowed the lantern's feeble glow. Lana Nguyen stood at the guest house door, her flashlight's beam cutting through the mist as she adjusted her backpack. The hum roared in her ears, a relentless pulse that had grown louder since Hui's disappearance that morning. Her notebook lay open on the cot inside, its latest entry, stark. "High gone, Hollow's taking more, I have to see it." The whispers, "Lana, come," hadn't stopped, threading through the hum like a siren's call, daring her to act. She couldn't wait for Dr. Pham's cryptic advice, salt and silence, to make sense. The hollow was real, alive, and it had taken a child today. Min's faceless reflection, the eyeless figures in the mist, the voice on the tape, they weren't delusions. She'd come for a story, but now it was personal. Armed with her flashlight, recorder, and camera, she stepped into the night. The village silent behind her, its doors barred against the unseen. The trail to the hollow was slick with mud, roots glistening under her beam as she retraced her steps from the day before. The air thickened with each stride, heavy with the stench of rot, wet earth, and something older, sharper, like decayed flesh. The hum vibrated through her boots, a tremor that rattled her teeth. She clicked on the recorder, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "Heading down, 9:37 p.m. If I don't come back, this is why." The whispers answered, "Stay. Join us." Soft and layered, curling around her like fog. The ravine's edge loomed ahead, a black maw ringed by gnarled trees, their roots dangling into the void. Lana paused, her flashlight sweeping the drop. The mist churned below, alive with shadows that flickered just beyond the light. She tied a rope to a tree, testing its strength, and began her descent, boots slipping on the steep, muddy slope. Roots brushed her legs, cold and slick, twisting like fingers in the dark. The hum deepened, a growl that shook the earth, and the air grew colder, her breath fogging in tight bursts. Halfway down, she stumbled, her flashlight clattering against a rock. The beam spun, illuminating a scattering of bones. Small, fragile, some gnawed clean. A child's ribcage gleamed in the light, and her stomach lurched. "Hi!" she whispered, but the hum drowned her voice. She steadied herself, retrieving the flashlight, and pressed on, the whispers growing louder. "Lana, here." At the bottom, the hollow stretched out, a barren wasteland of mud and stone, the mist thick and suffocating. Her beam caught the cave mouth from Min's tape, its jagged edges stark against the ravine's wall. Bones littered the entrance, human, animal, piled haphazardly, their surfaces etched with strange, spiraling marks. The hum pulsed from within, a heartbeat she felt in her chest. She snapped photos, the camera's flash blinding in the gloom, and stepped closer, the recorder still rolling. A shadow moved inside the cave, sudden lurching, a figure staggering into the light. Lana froze, her beam locking on it. A woman, her face a ruin of hollow sockets, her mouth gaping in a silent scream. Her skin was gray, stretched tight over bones, and she swayed, eyeless, as if drawn by the sound of Lana's breath. "You hear us now." The figure rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers echoing from the cave. Lana's scream caught in her throat. She stumbled back, tripping over a stone, her flashlight slipping from her grip. It rolled, casting wild arcs of light as the woman lurched closer, her bony fingers twitching. "Stay, stay," the whispers chanted, spilling from the cave in waves. Lana scrambled up, grabbing the light, and ran, her boots sinking into the mud. The rope dangled ahead, her lifeline back to the surface. She climbed, heart pounding, the hum shaking the ravine. The whispers chased her. "Lana, come back," clawing at her mind. She reached the top, collapsing onto the trail, mud streaking her jacket. Her flashlight flickered, its beam weak, but the village lights glimmered in the distance. She checked her recorder, hands trembling, every word, every whisper captured. The hollow wasn't just a place, it was a graveyard, a hunger, and it had seen her. It had. Chapter 8. The marked dawn crept over Thunglung village on March 27th, 2025, a pale, reluctant light that barely pierced the mist, cloaking the stilted houses. Lana Nguyen stumbled through the guest house door, her boots caked with hollow mud, her jacket streaked with grime from her night's descent. The hum followed her, a low, insistent pulse that throbbed in her skull. Inescapable since she'd fled the ravine. Her flashlight dangled uselessly from her hand, its battery flickering out, and her recorder hung heavy in her pocket, laden with the whispers, "Lana, come back," and that eyeless woman's rasping voice. She slammed the door shut, the lock clicking with a hollow sound that offered no comfort. She sank onto the cot, her breath ragged, the room spinning as exhaustion clawed at her. The bulb overhead buzzed, its light dim and unsteady, casting shadows that twitched like living things. She peeled off her jacket, wincing as her left arm ached. A sharp, burning sting that hadn't been there before. Rolling up her sleeve, she froze. A black handprint seared her skin, its fingers long and jagged, pulsing faintly as if alive. The mark glistened, wet-looking, and the pain flared with each beat of her heart. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice cracking in the stillness. Lana stumbled to the cracked mirror above the dresser, tilting her arm to the light. The handprint shimmered, its edges shifting, sinking deeper into her flesh. She touched it, and a jolt of cold shot through her, straight to her chest, her head, her bones. The hum surged, vibrating the mirror, and the recorder clicked on from her pocket, unbidden. "You're marked." The whispers hissed, layered and gleeful, spilling from the device. She yanked it out, slamming the stop button, but the words echoed in her ears. "You're marked!" Panic gripped her. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking as she dialed Dr. Pham, the folklorist from Hanoi. The signal was weak, static crackling through the line. But his voice broke through after 3 rings, groggy with sleep. "Lana, it's early." "There's a mark," she cut in, her voice trembling. "On my arm, a handprint, black, moving. What is this?" A long pause, then Dr. Pham's tone shifted, sharp and urgent. "The hollow's spirit. It binds itself to the living. You've been too close. It'll take you piece by piece. Voice, sight, soul, until you're one of them. One of them." Her mind flashed to the eyeless woman, Min's voided reflection. "How do I stop it?" "Salt might slow it," he said, his words clipped. "Old rituals, prayers, offerings. But it's awake now. It won't let go easily." The line hissed, then died, leaving her staring at the blank screen. Lana dropped the phone, her gaze darting back to the mark. It pulsed again, darker now, the pain a steady burn. She rummaged through her backpack, finding a half-empty water bottle and a packet of salt from a Hanoi street vendor. meager defenses against something she couldn't name. She sprinkled the salt over the mark, wincing as it hissed like acid on skin, the black edges recoiling briefly before settling again. The whispers laughed, "Stay, stay," soft and mocking, threading through the hum. She paced the room, her boots thudding on the warped floorboards. The hollow had touched her, claimed her, and Dr. Pham's words rang true. She'd seen its victims, faceless and lost. Her recorder sat on the cot, its red light off but taunting, a vessel for the voices that wouldn't leave her alone. She grabbed her notebook, scribbling frantically. Mark on arm, black, alive, hollows taking me, salt helps. The pen shook, ink smudging as her hand brushed the page. A knock rattled the door, slow, deliberate. She flinched, clutching the salt packet. "Who's there?" She called, her voice hoarse. No answer, just another knock, heavier this time. She crept forward, peering through the crack. The porch was empty, mist swirling in the dawn light, but muddy footprints glistened on the boards, too long, too thin, trailing to the edge and vanishing. The hum swelled, a tide of sound that pressed against her chest, and the whispers came again. Lana. Hours. She backed away, the salt packet crumpling in her fist. The mark burned hotter, a tether pulling her toward the hollow. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was prey. Chapter 9. The Breaking. The sun hung low over Thung Lung village on March 27, 2025, its light a weak smear through the ever-present mist, casting the stilted houses in a sickly pallor. Lana Nguyen stumbled from the guest house, her eyes bloodshot, her left arm cradled against her chest, where the black handprint pulsed beneath her sleeve. The hum filled the air, a relentless drone that burrowed into her skull, louder since dawn, since the whispers. Lana, hours, had followed her from the empty porch. Sleep had been a fleeting, fractured thing, haunted by eyeless faces and the memory of bones in the hollow. Her vision blurred as she walked, colors bleeding at the edges, green trees smearing into gray, the red of a villager's coat melting into the mist. Faces distorted, too, stretching and twisting as she passed the market square. A woman's eyes sank into her skull for a moment, then snapped back, normal but wary. Lana blinked hard, shaking her head, but the world tilted, unsteady. The mark burned, a steady throb that synced with the hum, pulling at her senses. "It's taking me," she muttered, her voice raw, barely audible over the whispers threading through her mind. "Stay, stay." Villagers moved around her, their steps slow, deliberate, avoiding her gaze. A man muttered under his breath, clutching an amulet as he passed. "She's claimed," a woman whispered to another, their words sharp in the damp air. Lana's stomach twisted. Claimed. The hollow's mark was a brand, a signal they all recognized. She spotted Tuan near a stall, his scarf pulled tight, his eyes darting away when she approached. "Tuan," she called, her voice cracking. "Please, I need help." He flinched, stepping back, his hands trembling. "You went down there?" he said, low and accusing. "You saw it?" "I can't." He stopped, glancing at her arm, then turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Desperation clawed at her chest. She needed something, anything, to fight this. Dr. Pham's words, salt, rituals, swirled in her head, half-formed and useless without guidance. The hum pulsed louder, vibrating her bones, and her vision flickered again. A lantern warped into a gaping mouth, then snapped back. She stumbled toward Mrs. Ho's stall. The old woman's wiry frame hunched over a basket of herbs. "You knew," Lana said, her breath ragged. "You knew it'd do this. Tell me how to stop it." Mrs. Hoa's eyes narrowed, her staff tapping the mud. "You didn't listen," she rasped. It's in you now. Nothing stops it, only slows it. She reached into a pouch, pulling out a small sack of salt and a brittle scroll, its edges yellowed and curling. Take these. End it, or it ends you. She thrust them into Lana's hands and turned away, her dismissal final. Lana clutched the items, the salt gritty against her palm, the scroll fragile under her fingers. Her head throbbed, the whispers swelling. Lana, come. And her reflection in a nearby puddle flickered, her eyes gone, then back. A split-second void that made her gasp. She dropped to her knees, the mud soaking through her jeans, and sprinkled salt over the mark. It hissed, the pain flaring, but the black handprint shrank slightly, its edges retreating. The relief was fleeting. The hum roared back, and her ears rang with her name, louder, insistent. She staggered to her feet, the village spinning around her. Faces blurred into eyeless masks, mouths gaping in silent screams, then resolved into normal stares, fearful, accusing. Stay away, a man hissed, pulling his child close. Lana's throat tightened. She was a pariah now, a walking curse. The scroll crinkled in her grip, its faded ink hinting at prayers she couldn't read. Not yet. Her phone buzzed weakly. Dr. Pham again. Chant the words. Salt the ground. It might buy time. She fumbled with the scroll, her vision doubling, the characters swimming before her eyes. The mark pulsed, hotter now, and the whispers laughed. Ours, ours. A chorus she couldn't silence. She leaned against a stilt, the wood cold against her cheek, and whispered, I'm not done yet. But the hollow's grip tightened, breaking her piece by piece, and the village watched, waiting for her fall. Chapter 10. The ritual night, cloaked Thung Lung village on March 27, 2025. A thick, inky blackness that smothered the lantern's glow and turned the mist into a suffocating veil. Lana Nguyen stood at the hollow's edge, her flashlight trembling in her hand, its beams slicing through the fog to reveal the ravine's jagged lip. The hum roared, a tidal wave of sound that shook the ground beneath her boots, sinking with the black handprint pulsing on her arm. The mark burned hotter than ever, its edges writhing under her sleeve, a living tether to the hollow's hunger. Her vision flickered, trees twisted into skeletal claws, then snapped back, but she clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus. This was her last stand. In her other hand, she gripped Mrs. Ho's salt sack and the brittle scroll, its faded ink barely legible in the flashlight's glow. The whispers had grown relentless since dusk. Lana. Ours. A chorus that clawed at her mind, louder with every step toward the hollow. Dr. Pham's text, chant the words, salt the ground, echoed in her head, a fragile lifeline against the breaking she'd felt all day. Her recorder hung from her belt, rolling silently, capturing what might be her final words. She couldn't wait for dawn, not with the marks spreading, not with the hollow's pull dragging her closer. She tied her rope to a gnarled tree, the same one from her first descent, and started down, the slope slick with mud and roots. The air thickened, heavy with rot and a cold that bit into her bones. The hum deepened, rattling her chest, and the whispers swirled. Come, come, tugging at her will. She reached the bottom, her boots sinking into the hollow's barren floor, and swept her flashlight across the bones littering the ground. Hui's ribcage, Min's legacy, countless others. The cave mouth loomed ahead, black and gaping, its edges sharp as teeth. Lana opened the salt sack, scattering a thin line around her in a shaky circle. The granules hissed as they hit the mud, a faint steam rising where they landed. She unrolled the scroll, its words a mix of Vietnamese and older script she barely understood. Prayers to seal, to banish. Her voice cracked as she began, halting but determined. Hun ta roiji yengi. Evil spirit, depart. Rest in peace. The hum faltered, a brief stutter, and the mark on her arm flared, searing her skin. She gritted her teeth, chanting louder, the salt crunching under her boots as she widened the circle. The ground quaked, a low rumble that knocked her to one knee. Shadows rose from the mist, dozens of them, eyeless and gaping, their forms flickering like broken film. They pressed against the salt line, their whispers sharpening into shrieks. "Lana, stay." She clutched the scroll, her voice rising. "Troy buok, imlang." Bind and silence, and flung more salt toward the cave. The shadows recoiled, hissing, but a deeper voice boomed from the darkness. "You can't silence us." It was vast, layered, a roar that shook her bones and drowned her chant. Her flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering as the shadows surged closer, clawing at the salt barrier. The mark pulsed, a fire spreading up her arm, and her vision blurred. Her reflection in a puddle flickered to a void, eyeless, mouthless, then back. "No!" she shouted, scattering the last of the salt, her voice raw. The circle held barely, the shadows writhing just beyond it. She finished the chant, the scroll trembling in her hands. "Yen nunki vin vien," rest forever. And the hum spiked, a deafening wail that split the air. The flashlight died, plunging her into darkness. The shadows lunged, their cold fingers brushing her skin as the salt line cracked. She screamed, dropping the scroll, and scrambled back. The rope, her only guide. The whispers roared. Ours. And the mark burned white hot, a chain pulling her toward the cave. She grabbed the rope, climbing frantically, her boots slipping on the muddy slope. The shadows clawed at her legs, their touch ice and ash. But she hauled herself up, collapsing at the ravine's edge. Her flashlight lay dead beside her, the scroll lost below. The hum settled, quieter but unbroken, and the whispers lingered. "Lana. Soon." A promise in the mist. The mark throbbed, darker now, its fingers stretching toward her elbow. The ritual had failed. Or worse, it had only angered the hollow. She crawled back toward the village, the night pressing in, her strength fraying at the seams. Chapter 11. The taken darkness swallowed Lana Nguyen as she awoke on March 27, 2025. Her body sprawled across the hollow's cold, muddy floor. The air was thick, rancid with rot, pressing against her lungs like a wet cloth. Her flashlight was gone, lost in the chaos of the failed ritual, and the hum roared, a deafening pulse that drowned her ragged breaths. The mark on her arm burned, its black fingers stretching past her elbow, pulsing with a life of its own. She groped the ground, her hands brushing bones, sharp, brittle, human, and recoiled, a choked sob escaping her lips. The whispers filled the void. "Lana, ours." A chorus so close, it felt inside her skull. She couldn't remember falling. The ritual had crumbled. Salt scattered, scroll torn away, and the shadows had dragged her down, their icy grip pulling her into the cave. Her head throbbed, a dull ache from where she'd hit the ground, and her vision flickered, the darkness shifting with faint shapes. She crawled forward, mud slick under her palms, until her fingers brushed the cave's jagged wall. Bones crunched beneath her, a pile of them, skulls and ribs tangled in a grotesque heap, their surfaces etched with those spiraling marks she'd seen before. A puddle gleamed ahead, reflecting a sliver of light from some unseen source. Lana leaned over it, her breath hitching. Her reflection stared back. No eyes, no mouth, just a black void where her face should have been. She screamed, but no sound came, her throat tightening as if stitched shut. The whispers laughed. "You're ours." And the mark flared, a searing pain that buckled her knees. She clawed at her face, fingers finding flesh, eyes, lips, still there, still hers. The reflection lied or warned. Footsteps echoed, quick, uneven, cutting through the hum. "Lana," a voice called, strained and familiar. "Tuan," she turned, hope flickering, as his flashlight beam pierced the cave, sweeping over the bone-strewn floor. His scarf hung loose, his eyes wide with terror as he spotted her. "You're alive! Come on! We have to—" His words died as the shadows rose, surging from the walls like ink spilling upward. "Tuan, run!" Lana rasped, her voice weak, barely breaking the silence. He didn't move, frozen as the eyeless figures closed in. Tall, thin, their mouths gaping in silent shrieks. One lunged, its bony hand snagging his scarf, and he screamed, the sound raw and piercing. Lana staggered to her feet, lunging toward him, but the shadows were faster. They dragged him down, his flashlight clattering to the ground, its beams spinning wildly. His cries cut off, swallowed by the hum, and the shadows retreated, leaving only silence. She stumbled to where he'd fallen, her hands shaking as she grabbed the flashlight. The beam caught his scarf, torn and muddy, but Tuan was gone, vanished like Hui, like Min. The whispers swelled, more, gleeful, insatiable. The mark pulsed, its black tendrils creeping toward her shoulder, and her vision blurred again. The cave walls warping into a tunnel of eyeless faces, all chanting her name. Lana sank to her knees, the flashlight slipping from her grip. Her reflection in the puddle flickered once more. Void, then back, a cycle she couldn't stop. The hum pressed in, a weight crushing her chest, and the whispers tightened their grip. Stay, stay, pulling at her will. She clawed at the mud, searching for the rope, the salt, anything, but her hands found only bones. Tuan had come for her, and now he was lost. Another offering to the hollow's hunger. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I'm sorry." The words muffled, fading. The mark burned hotter, a chain binding her to the cave, and the shadows loomed closer, their cold fingers brushing her skin. She curled into herself, the flashlight's beam dimming, its light swallowed by the dark. The hollow had taken Tuan, and it was taking her, piece by piece, just as Dr. Pham had warned. The whispers sang her name, a lullaby of doom, as her strength ebbed away. Chapter 12. The Silence. Morning broke over Thunglung village on March 28, 2025. A muted gray dawn that seeped through the mist like a half-formed dream. The stilted houses stood silent, their lanterns extinguished, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Mrs. Hua hobbled onto the guest house porch, her bamboo staff tapping the muddy boards, her weathered face set in a grim line. She swept the steps with a worn broom, the bristles scraping against the wood, a rhythmic sound that filled the void where the hum had once been. "Another one gone," she muttered, her voice a dry rasp, barely louder than the drizzle pattering on the roof. The village stirred slowly, villagers emerging with bowed heads and hushed voices. The market square lay empty, the stalls abandoned, Hui's shoe still resting in the mud, a silent monument to the hollow's toll. Lana's minivan sat untouched near the communal hall, its tires sinking into the earth, rain streaking its dusty windows. No one approached it. No one dared. The guesthouse door hung ajar, the room inside stripped of life. Lana's backpack, her notebook, her camera, all gone, as if she'd never been there. Mrs. Hua paused her sweeping, her sharp eyes flicking to the forest beyond the village. The hollow's home had faded at dawn, a sudden silence that unsettled her more than its presence ever had. She spat into the mud, a ritual of defiance, and muttered a prayer under her breath, "Yen Yi." But the words felt hollow, powerless against what she knew lingered. The village had lost another, and the quiet was no victory. It was a pause, a breath before the next taking. Beyond the trail, the hollow waited, its mist thicker than ever. curling upward like smoke from a smoldering fire. The ravine's edge gleamed wetly in the faint light, roots dangling into the void, untouched by the morning's drizzle. A faint sound broke the stillness, a whisper, soft and layered, drifting from the depths. "Lana." It joined the chorus, a new voice among the countless others, woven into the mist like a thread in a tapestry of the lost. Her recorder lay in the dirt near the edge, its casing cracked, its red light blinking weakly. The tape inside spun slowly, capturing the silence until her voice, faint, fractured, crackled through. "I'm here. Forever." The words looped, a final testament scratched into the audio, her last breath preserved in the machine she'd carried to her end. The mist swirled around it, tendrils brushing the device as if claiming it too. In the village, a child glanced toward the forest, then turned away, clutching his mother's hand. The adults whispered among themselves, "She went down. It took her. The outsider." Their voices low, resigned. Mrs. Hua finished her sweeping, leaning on her staff as she stared at the hollow's distant shadow. She'd warned Lana, given her salt and prayers, but the girl had pushed too far, stirred too much. The hollow didn't forgive. The silence stretched, heavy and wrong, a void where the hum had once lived. But beneath it, the whispers lingered, faint, persistent, a promise of return. "Lana," they called, joined by Tuan and Hui, and names older than the village itself, a roll call of the taken. The mist thickened, hiding the ravine's depths, and the recorder's light flickered out, its battery spent. Mrs. Hoa turned back to the guest house, her staff sinking into the mud with each step. The village would go on, as it always had, quiet, watchful, feeding the hollow its silence to keep it at bay. But the minivan remained, a relic of the outsider who'd come seeking truth and found only the void. The whispers faded into the mist, a lullaby for the lost, and the hollow slept, sated for now, its hunger coiled beneath the earth. The silence held, but it wouldn't last.